In March 1930, Mr. Vivian, the district commissioner, was on tour in an area where a man-eating tigress had been active. On the 22nd of that month, he sent me an urgent message asking me to come to Chowgarh Forest Rest House. 2 days later, I reached the Chowgarh Forest bungalow just in time for breakfast, where Mr. and Mrs. Vivian were staying. Over breakfast, the Vivians told me something shocking. Just a day before I arrived, while they were having tea on the bungalow courtyard, 6 women were cutting grass nearby. Suddenly, the tigress attacked one of them, tigress killed her, and dragged her into the jungle. Mr. Vivian and his staff quickly grabbed their rifles and followed the drag marks. They found the woman's body hidden under a bush near an oak tree. Corbett wrote. Later I checked the spot and saw signs that the tigress had stayed close, hiding just 50 yards away in a patch of raspberry bushes. That night, Vivian and his team built a wooden platform, called a macan, in the oak tree, hoping to shoot the tigress if she returned. They also put up 2 more wooden platforms, or macan nearby. They all stayed awake the whole night, but the tigress did not come back. The next morning, the woman's body was cremated, and they tied a young buffalo as bait about half a mile from the bungalow. That night, the tigress killed the buffalo. The Vivians waited again the next evening, sitting over the dead buffalo. There was no moon, and as darkness grew, they heard and then saw something approaching. In the dim light, they mistook the tigress for a bear. Sadly, that mistake cost them the chance to shoot the man-eater. Both Mr. and Mrs. Vivian were good shots and could have ended the story right there. On the 25th, the Vivians left Chowgarh. That same day, my 4 buffaloes arrived from Dalkania. I tied them along the forest road, a few hundred yards apart, hoping the tigress would take one. For 3 nights, she came close to the buffaloes but didn't touch them. On the 4th night, finally, one of the buffaloes near the bungalow was killed, but not by the tigress. When I checked in the morning, I realized that a pair of leopards, whom I had heard calling the night before, had done it. I didn't want to fire my gun in this area and scare away the tigress, but I also knew if I didn't act, the leopards would kill my remaining buffaloes. So I waited until they came out to sun themselves on some rocks, and I shot both of them. The forest road from the Chowgarh bungalow runs west through beautiful woods full of pine, oak, and rhododendron trees. Unlike many other parts of Kumaon, there's a lot of wildlife here, deer like sambar and kakar, wild pigs, and many birds. Twice, I suspected the tigress had killed a sambar in this forest, and I found bloodstains in sand, but I could never find the dead body of him. For the next 14 days, I spent every daylight hour walking alone in the forest or along the quiet road. No one else ever came here. Twice during those days, I came close to the tigress. On one of those days, I visited a small village on the south face of the Chowgarh ridge. The village had been abandoned the year before because of the tigress. On my way back, I took a cattle track that led over the ridge and down to the forest road. As I approached a pile of rocks on this path, I suddenly felt a strong sense of danger. From the top of the ridge to the forest road was about 300 yards. The path first went steeply downhill, then curved to the right and ran diagonally for about 100 yards. The rocks were on the right side of this stretch. After the rocks, the path made a sharp left turn and eventually joined the forest road. I had walked this path many times before, but this was the first time I felt afraid. I knew the tigress could be hiding behind those rocks. Avoiding them meant either pushing through thick, dangerous undergrowth, or making a long detour. Both risky, and there wasn't enough daylight left. I had to take the path which passed from the rocks. The wind was blowing uphill, which worked in my favor. I ignored the thick jungle on the left and focused completely on the rocks to my right. The dangerous stretch was only about 100 feet, and I walked sideways, step by step, my rifle ready and eyes fixed on the rocks. It must have looked strange to anyone watching, but it was the safest way. Just 30 yards past the rocks, I reached a small open glade that went up the hill, partly hidden by bushes. There, I saw a Chowgarh deer, also called barking deer. She was quietly grazing. She hadn't noticed me. I watched her from the corner of my eye. When she finally saw me, she froze, as deer often do when they think they haven't been seen. And so I continued carefully on my way, knowing how close danger had been. The tigress was still out there, clever and silent. After passing the sharp hairpin bend in the path, I glanced over my shoulder. The Chowgarh, that little barking deer, had gone back to eating grass peacefully. I took a few more steps down the track when suddenly I heard her barking wildly, and I saw her darting up the hill in panic. In just a few quick steps, I rushed back to the bend. I looked down the slope and noticed a slight movement in the bushes. It was clear now, the Chowgarh had seen the tigress. And the only place she could have spotted the tigress was on the track behind me. The movement in the bushes might have been a bird flying off, or it might have been the tigress, herself slipping into cover. I had to be sure. I couldn't continue without checking. There was a little trickle of water flowing from the rocks onto the path, which had made the red clay soft and perfect for catching footprints. I looked down and saw my own boot marks, and over them were the wide, round pug marks of the tigress. She had jumped down from the rocks after I passed them, and had been quietly following me. But then, the Chowgarh had seen her and sounded the alarm. That warning cry ruined her plan. So, the tigress quickly left the path and slipped into the bushes, exactly where I had seen that slight movement. She knew this ground very well. Since she couldn't attack me at the rocks, she was probably now making her way through the thick undergrowth, trying to ambush me further down the path, most likely at the second bend. I knew I couldn't continue walking along the track, it was too risky now. So instead, I followed the Chowgarh deer up the open grassy slope. Then circled around and came down to the forest road below, keeping to open ground where the tigress couldn't hide. Had there been more daylight left, I believe I could have turned the tables on her that evening. She had come out into the open after leaving the rocks. I knew the terrain just as well as she did, and while she had no idea that I was aware of her presence, I knew exactly what she was planning to do to me. But even though the odds were in my favor, it was too late in the day, the jungle was getting dark, and I had no safe shot. Now, I've spoken before about that strange sense, the feeling that warns you when danger is close. I won't go into much detail here, but let me say this, it's real. I don't know how it works or where it comes from, but it saved my life more than once. On that day, I hadn't heard or seen the tigress. No animal had warned me. But the moment I came over the ridge and saw those rocks, I just knew, without any doubt, that danger was waiting there. And a few minutes later, the Chowgarh's alarm call and the tigress's pug marks over mine proved I was right. The man-eater was clever, quiet, and deadly. But sometimes, something beyond sight and sound can still guide you safely through the jungle. Corbett wrote, "To all of you who have patiently followed my journey so far, I now want to share the moment. I had my first, and last, face-to-face encounter with the man-eating tigress. It happened in the early afternoon on the 11th of April, 1930. 19 days had passed since I had arrived at Kala Agar village. That day, I left the bungalow around 2 p.m. to tie up my 3 buffaloes at different spots along the forest road as bait for the tigress. About a mile from the bungalow, where the road crossed a ridge and curved around the mountain, I came across a large group of villagers collecting firewood. Among them was an old man. He pointed down the hill toward a patch of young oak trees, about 500 yards away, and told me something heartbreaking. A month ago, his only son, an 18-year-old boy, had been killed by the tigress in that very thicket. I hadn't heard his version of the story, so we sat down at the edge of the road and listened while he spoke. He said the boy was killed while he and 25 other men were gathering firewood. But when the tigress attacked, all the others ran away and left his son behind. He blamed them bitterly. Some of the men sitting nearby had been there that day and quickly defended themselves. They said it was the old man's son who panicked, shouted that he heard the tiger growling, and told everyone to run. But the old man wasn't convinced. He shook his head and said, "You are grown men. He was just a boy. And you ran away and left him to be killed." I regretted asking the question that started this argument. So, to calm things down, and out of respect for the old man's pain, I said I would tie one of my buffaloes near the place where his son had died. I handed 2 of the buffaloes to the villagers and kept one with me. 2 of my men came with me. A narrow path began nearby and led down the hill, through a valley, then up to the other side through a beautiful pine tree covered slope. It joined the forest road again 2 miles ahead. Along this path was a small clearing, about 30 yards wide. Right next to the oak thicket where the boy had been killed. In the center of the clearing stood a young pine sapling. I cut it down and tied the buffalo to its stump. I told one of my men to cut grass for the buffalo while the other, named Madho Singh, a former soldier who had served in the Great War and now worked in the Civil Pioneer Force, climbed up a nearby oak tree. I told him to bang his axe on dry branches and shout loudly, just like villagers do when gathering leaves. This noise would attract the tigress, I hoped. I then climbed up on a rock, about 4 feet tall, on the lower edge of the clearing. Beyond the rock, the hill dropped steeply into thick jungle filled with trees and bushes. Madho Singh continued shouting and singing from the tree. The other man was carrying grass to the buffalo, and I stood calmly on the rock, smoking, with my rifle resting in my left arm. Then, suddenly, I knew, the man-eater had arrived. I couldn't see her, but something told me she was near. I quickly signaled the man cutting grass to come to me, then whistled and waved to Madho Singh to stop making noise and stay still. The area around us was fairly open, and I could clearly see the buffalo getting nervous. Madho Singh was in the tree to my left front. The grass cutter had been straight in front of me, and the buffalo was off to my right. If the tigress had come from any of those directions, I would have seen her. That meant she had to be behind me, and just below the rock I was standing on. When I had climbed the rock earlier, I had noticed that its far side was steep and smooth, sloping down for about 8 to 10 feet, hidden by thick undergrowth and young pine saplings. The tigress could have climbed it. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. I had counted on hearing her in the bushes if she tried. I'm certain she had heard Madho Singh shouting, and followed the sound until she reached the base of the rock. And just as she was standing there, looking up at me, maybe deciding her next move, that's when I felt it, that deep instinct, telling me she was there. After realizing the tigress might be right behind the rock I was standing on, I made a sudden move to face her direction. But the silence that followed, and maybe that quick movement, made her suspicious. A few minutes later, I heard a dry twig snap down the slope. That signaled she was leaving, and the tense feeling in the air slowly faded. The chance to shoot her was gone, but not all hope was lost. She would almost certainly return. And if she came back and found us gone, she might attack the buffalo we had tied up instead. There were still 4 or 5 hours of daylight left, and I had an idea. By crossing the valley and climbing the opposite hill, I could watch the whole slope where the buffalo was tied. It would be a long shot, between 200 and 300 yards, but I was carrying a .275 rifle, which was very accurate. Even if I didn't kill her right away, a wounded tigress would leave a blood trail, much better than blindly searching for her across hundreds of square miles of forest. As I had been doing for months. But there was a problem, the 2 men with me. Sending them back to the bungalow alone would have been dangerous, maybe even deadly. So, I decided to keep them with me. I tied the buffalo securely so the tigress couldn't drag it away. Then we left the clearing and got back on the forest path to reach the opposite hill. About 100 yards ahead, the path crossed a deep ravine. The far side of the path was thick with bushes and undergrowth. Since it wasn't safe to go into that thick jungle with the men following me, I decided to go down into the ravine instead. I would follow it down to the valley, then climb up the other side to rejoin the path beyond the dense jungle. The ravine was about 10 yards wide and 4 or 5 feet deep. As I stepped into it, my hand touched a rock, and a nightjar, a small jungle bird, fluttered up. On the spot where it had been sitting, I found 2 eggs. They were straw-colored with rich brown spots, but what caught my eye was how different they were in shape. One was long and pointed, the other round like a marble. I didn't have any nightjar eggs in my collection, so I decided to take them. I had nothing to carry them in, so I carefully cupped my left hand, placed the eggs inside, and packed some moss around them for safety. As we walked down the ravine, the banks got steeper. About 60 yards in, we came to a sudden drop, around 12 to 14 feet deep. The monsoon rains had smoothed the rocks like glass over the years. It was too steep to climb down safely, so I gave the rifle to the men, sat at the edge, and slid down. My feet had just touched the sandy bottom when the 2 men leapt down beside me and urgently thrust the rifle back into my hand. Their faces were full of fear. They asked, breathless, "Did you hear that growl?" I hadn't heard anything, probably because of the noise my clothes made sliding down the rocks. But they swore they'd heard a deep growl, very close by. They couldn't tell where it had come from exactly. It was strange. Tigers usually stay silent when hunting. I can't explain it perfectly, but maybe the tigress had followed us from the clearing, and when she saw us head down the ravine, she ran ahead and waited at a narrow point. Perhaps, just as she was about to pounce on me, I vanished down the slide, and the growl was her sound of frustration. Of course, this is just a guess, unless she had chosen me specifically as her prey and not the 2 men, there's no solid explanation. Now we were standing in a tight spot. Behind us was the smooth, steep rock we had slid down. To our right, a 15-foot-high rock wall leaned slightly over the ravine. To our left, a messy, towering bank of rocks, 30 to 40 feet high. The sandy ground under our feet was only about 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. A giant pine tree had fallen across the lower end of the ravine, trapping sand behind it. As I moved slowly forward along the sandy bed, my feet made no sound. Near the end of the overhanging rock wall, I noticed the sandy stretch continued behind it. Let me try to describe what I saw. The hidden space behind the giant rock looked like a classroom slate standing upright, thick at one end, leaning slightly outwards, and nearly 15 feet tall. As I stepped past it and turned my head to look over my right shoulder, I looked straight into the tigress's face. Yes, she was right there. The ground she lay on was flat and sandy, boxed in on 3 sides, the tall leaning rock on one side, a steep bank tangled with thorny bushes on the other, and behind her, another steep slide like the one we had come down. The space was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. Lying there, with her front legs stretched out and her back legs tucked neatly under her, was the tigress. Her head was raised just a little off her paws. She was only 8 feet away from me, I measured the distance later. And on her face, was a strange look. It was a calm, almost friendly smile, the kind you see on a dog's face when it sees its master coming home after a long absence. 2 quick thoughts flashed in my mind. First, I had to make the first move. Second, whatever I did, it had to be calm and smooth, I must not startle her. The rifle was already in my right hand, held across my chest. The safety catch was off. But to aim it at her, I would have to slowly swing it around, nearly 3/4 of a full circle. With my left hand still holding the bird eggs and the rifle in my right, I began slowly turning the gun toward the tigress. I moved carefully, inch by inch, so she wouldn't notice what I was doing. At first, the rifle stock touched my side. I had to stretch my arm fully and continue swinging the barrel toward her body. The rifle was getting heavy, and my arm was tiring. Still, I kept my eyes locked on hers. She hadn't moved or even blinked. That calm, almost friendly expression was still on her face. To me, the whole movement felt painfully slow, like a nightmare where you're trying to act but your body won't respond. But finally, the muzzle pointed at her chest. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed loudly in the tight, rocky space. I felt the recoil in my shoulder. But the tigress didn't move. For a brief moment, it seemed like the bullet had done nothing, like those terrible dreams where your gun refuses to fire. Then, slowly, her head dropped onto her paws, and a thin stream of blood flowed from the bullet wound. The shot had struck her spine and shattered the top of her heart. The two men who had followed behind me couldn't see the tigress, as a big rock was between us. But when they saw me suddenly stop and turn, they realized I had spotted her. Madho Singh later told me he wanted to shout, drop the eggs and use both hands on the rifle. But he didn't. After I fired and lowered the rifle, Madho Singh came forward and gently took it from me, because suddenly, my legs felt weak, and I could barely stand. I made my way to the fallen tree and sat down. I didn't need to check her paw prints to know it, this was the Chowgarh tigress, the same man-eater I'd been tracking for over a year. The one who had taken 64 lives, some locals even claimed the number was over 100. Her time had come, and while she was moments away from adding me to her list, fate had turned in my favor. Strangely, 3 things that should have worked against me, ended up saving my life. 1. The bird eggs in my left hand. Because I couldn't use both hands on the rifle, I didn't make any sudden movements. If I had turned too fast, she might have attacked right away. 2. My light rifle, a heavier gun wouldn't have allowed me to swing it into position with one hand. 3. The fact she was a man-eater, a normal tiger would have panicked in a tight spot and charged. But this tigress was used to stalking and planning her kills. That hesitation gave me my chance. While Madho Singh and the other man took a longer route up the hill to untie the buffalo and bring down a rope, I climbed back up the rocks, to return the eggs to the nightjar's nest. Yes, I admit I'm just as superstitious as many hunters. For over a year, I had tried and failed to get even a glimpse of the tigress. But just minutes after I picked up those 2 odd-shaped eggs, everything changed. I considered them lucky. The eggs had stayed perfectly safe in my hand all that time. They were still warm when I placed them back on the small hollow of rock where I had found them. And when I came back a short while later, the mother bird had returned. Her feathers matched the rock so perfectly that it was almost impossible to spot her. As for the buffalo, now tame after months of care, it followed the men down the hill like a loyal dog. When it reached the spot where the tigress lay, it sniffed her body and then calmly lay down nearby, chewing its cud. The men had brought down a strong wooden pole. We lashed the tigress to it tightly. I asked Madho Singh to go back to the bungalow and bring help, but he refused. He said this was their kill too, and they would not share the honor of carrying it with anyone else. So the 3 of us, all strong men, and used to hard labor, began the exhausting task of carrying the dead tigress up the hill. The forest path was too narrow and twisted for the long pole, so we went straight through the thick jungle, pushing through raspberry thickets and thorny bushes that tore our clothes and left our skin raw. By the time we reached the top, we were scratched, bruised, and utterly worn out. But we had done it. The Chowgarh man-eater was no more. If you liked the story, please don't forget to like and subscribe to your channel, Worst Animal Attacks. We will soon be back with other exciting stories. Till then, take care.